Hi, my name's Jack. I'm an addict. Well, Phoenix has come a long way. I got a podium now. The last time I spoke here, they just handed me a microphone in the middle of the floor. I didn't know whether I was supposed to dance or sing. Fortunately for people there, I didn't do either. But I'm thinking about doing one now. You have to bear with me. It takes me a while to get going, and then you'll have to get the hook to get me off of here. Drugs probably rescued me. I was kind of a mess, like it seems like a lot of us were before we ever started using. I certainly was. I wasn't a very happy kid. Didn't feel like I fit in anywhere. Later on, about a year into recovery, if that, in one of my inventories, I came to find out the feeling that I'd felt most of my life as a kid was alone. I guess it became such a normal feeling that I really didn't know what it was I felt. I just knew I didn't like what I felt as a kid, and I didn't have a label for it. I didn't know what it was I felt, which is a whole nother problem that still goes on in recovery, is trying to be in touch with my feelings and identify them and then express them. But around the age of 12, well, I guess at the age of 4, I already decided that the world was not a very wonderful place to be involved in, and literally made a decision to drop out, which basically amounted for me to withdraw into myself and shut the world out as best as I could, and that was my survival mechanism. And then I guess when I was around 11 years old or so, I started wanting to do the things that other teenagers were doing, and I felt very awkward at everything that I tried to do. Talking to girls scared the shit out of me. Trying to dance, I couldn't do it. People tried to teach me, and I felt like I was, I had 2 left feet. Could never quite get it done right, and that didn't happen until I went to a New Year's Eve party and got loaded for the first time. And that night I learned how to dance real quickly, without any lessons, and I learned how to talk to girls, and I learned how to be what I thought was the life of the party. To this day, I don't know how well that worked, but it convinced me that it worked well, and that's all that mattered. I probably made a bigger fool of myself than I would have if I wasn't loaded and trying to dance. But the main point was I didn't know it, and I didn't feel awkward, and I didn't feel all those feelings that I felt when I wasn't loaded, so I knew this was the ticket. I knew that if I was going to be in a social situation, I was getting loaded. And basically that's what I did. And for me, I guess either because I immediately began consuming large quantities and took a lot of whatever it was I was taking at the time, and basically throughout my using I was a garbage can addict, although there was one primary thing that I was into usually at any given period. But those drugs seemed to have a short life. I'd burn them out and they would stop working. They didn't bring about the desired effect that they initially did. And initially, every chemical that I discovered, almost every chemical, until the end of my using, was like I discovered something. Like I discovered a secret, and I guess the first time I got loaded was in 1959, and at that time, I guess it wasn't at least, I don't know if it was as prevalent, but it certainly wasn't as out in the open as it is now. So I felt like I found a secret every time I discovered a new drug. And it was like I had this feeling inside that I just wanted to shout from the roofs what I discovered, because to me it was a great discovery. It allowed me to fit inside my skin. It allowed me to function out in that funny little world that I functioned in, which was very limited, although I thought it was pretty damn broad, especially once I started getting loaded and was able to get out of my house. So basically, about every 3 or 4 years, I had to discover something else, and then I discovered you could mix and match and get all kinds of different desired effects, and sometimes not such desired effects, but there was always something to change the direction of where you were going anyway. And I continually went on to do something that I swore I would never do, and I moved from drug to drug to drug to drug, and the last 4.5 years of my using was finally the last thing I was never going to do, which is use heroin. And that was the first drug that I discovered that I didn't want to shout from the rooftops. The first time I used heroin, I almost died. Which may have something to do with not wanting to shout from the rooftops. Although that didn't matter either, and I usually tell this story to give you a glimpse to the way I think, to the way I thought, possibly to the way I still think today. The first time I got loaded on heroin, I snorted a half a bag of dope, and I was hanging out on a very, like the place where everybody, the main drag in Brooklyn, and everybody was hanging out and the cars were going by and was standing in the doorways, and it was probably about 40 degrees out. It was freezing, but I had my nice thin little leather jacket on, freezing my ass off, but I was cool, and that was, of course, was then, and to a large degree sometimes still is, above all, the most important thing in the world. Look good, sound good, be right, and everything, and the rest you could go to hell. It doesn't matter as long as you look cool. And I looked cool. I had, I was freezing my ass off, and I was standing in this doorway, and all of a sudden my throat seized up, and I couldn't breathe. And I was standing there, and it's amazing how many thoughts go through your head, in a very short period of time, and all kinds of things were going through my head, and I kept trying to clear my throat, and nothing would happen, and I couldn't breathe, and it clearly became evident to me that I was probably going to die. But, since I couldn't breathe, I also couldn't talk. So the only way to get anybody's attention would have been to flail around and, jump up and down and look stupid. You see, so I didn't want to do that. I could have died cool as long as I didn't bring any attention to myself by looking like an idiot. So I literally made a decision that I'm going to stand there, and obviously I'm going to eventually just pass out and probably die. And for those of you that haven't figured it out, that didn't happen. Some of you may not be sure yet. And just as quickly as it started, it opened up and I was able to breathe. And the first thing I thought of is, I still got a half a bag of that shit in my pocket. So I walked around the corner and I snorted the other half a bag. So that was my solution to this shit almost killing me. Let's see if the other half can do it. And that's the way I thought. That was my thinking. That was my solution to problems. And I probably spent pretty much the next 4.5 years trying to stop using heroin. My idea before I got to this program, or when I got to this program, my idea of being clean was not using heroin. If I was only smoking weed, drinking wine, dropping reds, and taking a few psychedelics, I was clean. I never heard of the concept of total abstinence. I didn't know, I had never heard of Narcotics Anonymous, that's for sure. And I'd never heard of a drug addict that stayed clean. I met 2 drug addicts in New York that went through a program out there that stayed clean for about a year, and they did not have what I wanted. They were raving fanatical lunatics, clean, and eventually both of them fell and started getting loaded. So when I got here, I had never met a drug addict that stayed clean, and I was absolutely convinced that it was impossible. I believed the old lie, once an addict, always an addict. And I was absolutely convinced when I got here that I would eventually just die in a gutter somewhere or in a toilet somewhere. from an overdose. And actually, by the time I got here, that's what I really was wanting to do. Like I said, the last 4.5 years, I was constantly at least trying to stop using heroin, and thought that I had tried every possible way, and I tried some bizarre ways to stop using. Of course, it's pretty difficult when you don't really intend to stop using. You just want to give up one drug. So it becomes almost impossible, but I didn't know that then. I used to sit and try and figure out what the hell was wrong with me that had me going back to using time and time again, in spite of the fact that I kept telling myself I didn't want to do this. I'd go through a couple of days sick and go back to the connection, and as I was going to the connection, I'd ask myself, why am I doing this? But I would do it. And I didn't know any other way, and that's really simply the case. I didn't know there was another alternative. So I continued doing that. In 1970, I met or probably in 68 or 69, I guess 68, I met the lady that was going to become my first wife. And about a year and a half, 2 years later, when we decided to get married, my rationalization was to get married because being married, I wouldn't be a dope fiend, because obvious dope fiends don't get married, junkies don't get married. So I'll get married and then I'll stop using because I'll have responsibility and I'll have a wife. And this lady had no idea that I was a dope fiend. She knew that I dropped some pills once in a while, smoked a joint, took some acid every now and then, but she had no idea what I was doing. And around the same time that I decided to get married, somebody talked to me about going to programming school, and the same record went off in my head. Hey, programming, 1970, that was like the big thing. I'm going to go to school and become a programmer because programmers ain't dope fiends, So if I become a programmer and get married, I'm going to have it licked, man. There's no way in hell I'm going to continue using if I'm a married programmer. So I spent $1,200 to go to programming school. I spent 9 months in school, 9 months in school loaded, got an A+ in the course, came down with hepatitis 2 weeks later and tried to figure out why the hell I went to programming school. I didn't like it. Didn't want to be a programmer. And sure as hell didn't influence my using at all. So the next brilliant solution after I got married, and this lady still had no idea what I was doing, was move to California. New York's obviously my problem. Anybody that lives in New York's got to be a dope fiend. So if I move to California, I'll stop doing what I'm doing. So my wife got a transfer in her job. I quit mine, and we drove to California. And I kicked driving cross country, or I began to kick, and got to California, moved to Hollywood, which was a real smart move. There's probably some places in 1970 that I could have moved to in California that it might have been a semi-smart move, but Hollywood, half my neighborhood from Brooklyn was in Hollywood for the summer. I moved there in the summer. I didn't even know I left New York until 2 months after I got to California. But I didn't use any heroin, I just stayed loaded on everything else. For me, it became a vacation. My wife had to start working immediately, and I was always going to look for a job the next day. And after about 2 months of that bullshit, she left me a note one morning and said, we need to talk. And around that time, there's another good example of how my thinking was. Around that time, a friend of mine was going back to New York on business for a couple of weeks, and I was kind of getting homesick, and I thought it might be a good idea to go with him, but how could I justify to my wife going to New York for a couple of weeks vacation when I'd been on a 2-month vacation in California and still didn't have a job? And when she left me this note, I figured, oh shit, she's tired of my bullshit, and my head started working on how I could turn that into a 2-week vacation in New York. And I waited for her that night. She came home from work, and I said, what do you want to talk about? And she went on with all the bullshit that's been going on. and she's discouraged and all of this, and right away I had my plan. I said, you know what we need is probably about a 2-week separation from one another to sort things out and figure out what we want to do. And she just looked at me and said, I had something more permanent in mind. And all I heard was, hey, permanent is at least 2 weeks long. You know, I'll worry about what that really means when I get back. You know, but and actually I heard, hey, this is working out better than I thought it was, because now she can't deny me at least half of the money that she managed to put in the bank account. And that's what happened. And of course I wasn't going to use any heroin when I went back to New York. I just wanted to hang out and see some of the friends and all of that. And so I went from the airplane straight to the connection and came back 2 weeks later, strung out again, and with a nice something to keep me going until I could find some connections in California, because the first 2 months I really didn't even look for that. And anyway, I was off and running, and you know, and things really got out of hand at that point, because I guess I was bothered by the fact that my wife and I split up, but I didn't know it because I couldn't feel it, you know, because I had been so you know, I've been loaded all the time, and I couldn't feel it, and I didn't know how to identify my feelings, and I certainly didn't want to get honest with myself about that. But amazingly, at the same time, I started consuming large quantities of reds while I was shooting heroin, but I didn't associate that having anything to do with trying to just get out of the way I felt. And I started overdosing a lot, and I tried to stop, and it just became it really became an insane period for me, where I literally kept telling people I was tired. I was just tired of doing this shit and tired of living. I got arrested around that time, and that probably saved my life at the time. I spent a little over a month in county jail in Los Angeles and got healthy, and clearly became aware in there of the fact that I had a serious problem. Up until then, I really, in spite of the fact that I kept wanting to stop using heroin, I never really admitted that I had a problem of any kind. And what happened in the county jail was, after about the first 2 weeks, when I kicked and started to get it through my head that these people were serious about keeping me in jail, I started to feel good. You know, I started to feel better than I'd felt in a very, very, very long time. And it was real obvious to me that the only reason that I felt as good as I did was because I wasn't using. Because I was, for the first time in 12 years, clean. There was absolutely nothing in my system anymore. And that hadn't happened for 12 years. And I knew that had something to do with it. And I really knew it when I woke up Christmas morning and started checking out how good I felt in there, and that the best that I'd felt in a long time was in Los Angeles County Jail, is an indication that there's something wrong with your life. You know, sitting in a cage with 150 people sleeping on the floor, and I felt good, really made me aware that I had some serious problems if this is what made me feel good. And while I was in there, some guy got me reading some spiritual stuff in there, and I'd never much thought of anything spiritual, and that started making me feel good. As much as I tried to resist it at first, but there was nothing else to do, and I'd read this stuff and I'd start trying to practice. The thing that I remember was faith out of this book, and naturally, being a dope fiend, I decided to try practicing it every time I went to court. Let's see if faith really works, and I'll have faith that I'm getting out. And I got out. You know, I was just hoping they'd reduce my bail, and the judge just let me out. So I was kind of convinced about this stuff, and I was feeling good about some of the stuff that I was reading. I was feeling good about being clean, and I got out of jail, and I went back to my house, my apartment, and I started telling people about this spiritual stuff that I was learning, and everybody'd look at me cross-eyed, and you know, and then, you know, people looked at me cross-eyed enough, I stopped talking about it, because I was starting to wonder, you know what, you got yourself on a rib again, you know, you're bullshitting yourself. And naturally I started getting loaded, but I wasn't going to use any heroin, and I didn't for another 2 months. And then I came up with the brilliant idea that, hey, you know what? I need to find out if I really got this thing licked. And the only way to find out if I really got this thing licked is to go get some. And I didn't have that thing licked. And I did get some, and I was off and running again. And I really started overdosing a lot. And had a friend of mine living with me who was constantly hounding me, why do I keep doing that? And finally one day I just told him, I said, because I don't care. I really don't care because the thought that I would have every time I came out of an overdose is, what for? You know, why am I coming out of this? The only peace that I had. See, I used and was miserable. You know, after I would get loaded, I was still miserable. I was aware of the fact that my life was going absolutely nowhere. I felt like a big fat zero inside. And I was absolutely convinced there was no way out of this. And I can remember the conversation with my partner about 3 weeks before we both checked into a recovery house, when he told me, he said, you don't know what's around the corner. And I said, bullshit, we've been around enough corners together enough times to know that it always ends up back right where we, you know, I mean, we never really even get around the corner, you know. And I was absolutely convinced that nothing was going to happen. And 3 weeks later, his wife told him he needed to get into a recovery house if he didn't want a divorce. I decided to keep him company, and I didn't know anything about recovery houses, and we got this girl I was living with got us about 6 or 7 phone numbers, and one of the numbers was Narcotics Anonymous, and for some reason that's the number we chose, and we called what was then the World Service Office, or served as the World Service Office, and we asked them about a recovery house, and he told us that there was a place just opened up 3 days earlier, about 3 blocks away from there. So we called them up, made an appointment to go in for an interview. I dropped a handful of red, shot a bag of dope, and went in for my interview. Anyway, about 5 days later, we checked in and started going to meetings, and got introduced to a program, and heard things, and by then I had totally flipped, you know, in spite of that little brief bout of liking spirituality, I totally forgot that, came into the program, didn't believe in anything of a God at all, would argue with people in meetings when they would talk about God. To me, this sounded like a Christian organization. I'm Jewish and came in here, not that I ever acted Jewish, but suddenly I came into meetings, heard the word God, heard people praying and guys holding hands while they were doing it. Made me a little suspicious about what was really going on here. And I wouldn't pray at the end of the meeting because, as far as I was concerned, it was all a Christian movement. Not that, like I said, I wasn't much of a Jew to begin with, but I suddenly became Jewish. I became Jewish not believing in God. And I didn't, you know, the way I thought of things at that time was that there just couldn't possibly be a God. I was into feeling sorry for myself and feeling sorry for the world, and the world was a mess and all this crap, and if there was a God, this wouldn't be happening. But I kept going to meetings, or I stayed in the recovery house and they made me go to meetings. I didn't particularly want to go to as many meetings as they made me go to. They made me go to meetings every single day. You know, they were really cruel. They didn't let us stay home and watch TV, you know, and get into relationships and stuff like that. You know, they're really cruel people. And yet, you know, the first time I went to a meeting, I felt something. I really felt something in my gut that I didn't understand, but it felt okay. Every time I walked into a meeting, I felt okay inside, even when I was kicking, and I didn't know about detoxes in 1971. I don't know that there was too many of them when I got here in 1971, so I kicked in meetings, and but yet when I was in a meeting, it was okay. But being too hip, slick, and cool and not knowing how to talk about my feelings, I couldn't tell somebody, hey, you know what, I feel something inside that feels good. You know, because that sounded real lame to me to even think about it. But I felt something. And today I believe that's God as I understand Him. You know, and the love and the hope that exists in these rooms. And And I kept going to these meetings, and little by little, I would find myself, in spite of my attitude being real bad, I was one giant pain in the ass in this recovery house. And I was very rebellious, and I know nobody can identify with being rebellious, but I was very rebellious because none of the shit made sense to me. And I argued with a lot of people, and I argued in meetings about this thing called God that people talked about in meetings, and the love was there because nobody ever, in spite of how obnoxious I was in meetings, nobody ever told me to leave. They always told me to keep coming back, and people genuinely demonstrated love for me, and that's what they told me they would do. They told me they would love me until I could love myself, and that took a long time. I thought of myself as totally worthless when I got here. And the program is actually the first thing that began to give me a thread of hope, because after about a month or two, and having been told, especially my sponsor was continuously drumming into my head, if you want to keep it, you got to give it away. And the first time he told me that, I told him he was nuts, because that's a ridiculous concept. If you're brand new and first get here, to have somebody, off the streets, and have somebody tell you if you want to keep it, you got to give it away, that sounded like the line of shit that I used to hand people on the street. Yeah, you got to give it away to me. Give it to me. Because I didn't believe in giving anything away before I got to this program, and I didn't believe in it when I got here. But after a while, having my sponsor tell me, hey, you know what, if somebody checks into the house that's got 1 day and you got 5, tell him how you got 5 days, because he don't know how he's going to get 5 days. And that made a lot of sense to me. You see, I got 17 and a half years clean, and when I was new, that meant absolutely nothing to me. I was not impressed by anybody with a lot of time. I was impressed with the guy that took a 30-day chip, or took a 60-day chip, or a 90-day chip. That impressed me. Anything beyond that was beyond my comprehension. I didn't think it was possible. I really did not believe I could stay clean. And I didn't begin to believe it was possible until I woke up the day that I had 90 days. And the day that I woke up and had 90 days, it was like somebody hit me with a 2x4. It was like I woke up and I snapped, I had 90 days, and it was like, that was like some giant milestone, because it was at that point that I began to realize that it was possible. It was at that point that I began to believe that it was possible, that you people that said you had a year and 2 years and 5 years might have been telling the truth, because up until then I was very skeptical. I could not imagine people that said they were like me not using for a year, 2 years, and 3 years. It didn't make sense to me. But then I began to believe it was possible. I still had reservations, and when I had 10 and a half months, went back to New York and got loaded again, and came back to California. But for the first time, I knew what I wanted. I wanted what this program had to offer. I wanted to work this program. I wanted to get back what I had in that 10 and a half months. I wanted the hope that I had the hope. I never even lost it. Once I got back, I didn't lose it. And I began to feel like a human being. I began to feel like a human being because I found out that I had something that's very worthwhile. I have my experience as an addict, and if I work this program, I have the ability to affect somebody in their life at getting and staying clean. And that was the beginning of realizing that I had some worth to my life, because I had no self-worth. When I came back, I'd worked the first 4 or 5 steps before I went out and got loaded, and I believe that's why I got back, is because I did work the first 4 or 5 steps, first 5 steps. When I came back, I didn't believe that I worked the first 5 steps, because I knew that if I had worked the first 5 steps, I wouldn't have gotten loaded. And it took me a while, it took me about 30 days to realize that that wasn't true. But for the first 30 days after I got back, I was absolutely convinced I didn't work this program right, because I got loaded. And I was trying to do everything differently. And it took me 30 days to realize that the only thing that I did wrong the day I got loaded is I didn't work the first step. And I didn't work the first step. I had this whole plan that had absolutely nothing to do with being powerless. And after 30 days, it dawned on me I just didn't work the first step. I didn't admit my powerlessness that day. I just shined on everything I knew about the program. And also I went through alternatives, and I decided I wanted to get loaded that day. But I got back into working the steps, and I had to admit that I was powerless. It wasn't about getting powerless, it was about admitting I was powerless. My getting powerless was my years out there using, was the process of getting powerless. I had to realize that, and for the first time was able to realize that I didn't care what happened in my life, as long as I stayed clean. And before then, I had a whole lot of if-onlys. I needed the right woman, I needed the right job, I needed the right amount of money, the right clothes, the right car, all these things. If only these things were in my life, everything would be okay. And I was refusing to accept the fact that my life was totally unmanageable, and it didn't matter whether I got these things, because the fact was I had those things using. I had the wife, I had the car, I had the apartment, I had the clothes, I had all of that shit using, and I always blew it all. So none of those things were going to make me okay with me. And I came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity, and I realized that the second step, you see, the first time around I thought working the second step was going to restore me to sanity. I didn't particularly want to focus in on all that's promising me is that this power could restore me to sanity. It doesn't say a damn thing about being restored to sanity, and I've come to realize that the only way for that power to restore me to sanity is to work the rest of the steps. And then I came to the third step. When I came to the third step, that was the most difficult surrender for me, because I still had this difficulty with this thing called God. Higher power was okay because I basically looked at the fellowship as my higher power, and the rooms that I attended meetings in, those were my higher power. Because obviously something was happening there. Every time I would go to take the third step, I'd have this fantasy. I would see this real clear, especially in the early 70s on Hollywood Boulevard. There was a lot of Bible thumpers running up and down trying to convert everybody. And every time I got to the third step, I saw me, if I took this third step, that I was going to become one of these Bible thumpers, and I was going to be running up and down Hollywood Boulevard trying to convert people, and that freaked me out. I didn't want to be one of those people. And I went through this process for about 3 weeks. Probably about 5 or 6 times in that 3 weeks, I went to take the third step, and I would see that same picture, and I'd give it up, and I just couldn't do it. Because I believed that taking the third step meant I was letting go of everything. I was genuinely giving my will and my life over to the care of God, and that God might do anything with me, and anything was including being one of those people. And at the end of the 3 weeks, I went to go try and take the step again. I saw the same picture go pass through me, and I saw the whole thing, and then something occurred to me. What occurred to me is, how do I know that those people running up and down Hollywood Boulevard trying to convert everybody aren't very happy people? And I'd never been a very happy person. And if that's what God had intended for me, and that would result in my happiness, why the hell am I fighting it? Of my own doing, I hadn't done very good with my life. I had certainly never done anything that resulted in my being happy. So I decided that it didn't matter. If that's what God had in store for me, then so be it. And I let go, and I surrendered, and I took the third step. I eventually wrote enough inventories to include everything. I didn't have enough trust to include it all at one time. So I wrote things in piecemeal. I gave my sponsor the first inventory was to see what he was going to do with it, and I gave up a little piece. And I didn't hear it come back to me, so I assumed he kept it to himself, and I gave up a little more. And I gave up a little more, and I gave up a little more, and eventually wrote a thorough, fearless moral inventory where I put everything in it. And at that point, I distinctly remember feeling when I took the fifth step, that for the first time, I think I really feel like I'm a part of something, like I belong somewhere. For the first time, I heard people telling me back that they thought and felt the same things I did, you know, because I got to this program, I really thought I was different than everybody else. I didn't know people felt like I did, you know. Not once in my years hanging out on corners or wherever we hung out did any of my friends lean over to me and said, "Hey Jack, come here. I got to tell you, I'm really feeling insecure today." You know. Nobody ever said anything like that. Nobody ever expressed a feeling to me before. You know, nobody ever called me over and said, you know, while we were standing talking shit on the corner, saying, "Hey, you know what? I went to call up Jane last night for a date, and I dialed half the numbers and hung up the phone because I got scared." You know, but that's the way I felt. You know, but they all talked big shit on the corner, and I believed them. You know, until I got clean. When I was in the recovery house, I remember sitting there. I said, "God damn it, those son of a bitches were lying too." You know, they felt just as insecure and just as frightened and scared as I did, and I didn't know it. You know, I didn't know that they felt the same way. I didn't know until I got here, and everybody I talked to sounded like they felt the same feelings that I felt. So for the first time, I began to feel like I belonged somewhere. You know, and then I tried to work the rest of the steps, and I worked through the 12 steps, and a spiritual awakening had occurred. I believed in God. I began to read more material than program literature provided to find out more about God. I spent time talking about God. I probably, when I was 4 years clean, could talk a whole heck of a lot about God. I don't talk about God that much. Maybe I understand him less than I did when I had 4 years. I'm not sure. But the thing that I still know is that there's no way humanly possible for me to be where I am today from where I came from. You know, and a few myths that I developed somewhere along the line have certainly been shattered about this program. I believed working the program would eventually get rid of the fear, the insecurities, the inadequacies, all of those feelings, and I came to find out that my year cake didn't cure all of that. But I thought I still had hope that when I had 5 years, that all that stuff would go away and I'd have it made, and I got a 5-year cake and hit the worst depression of my recovery. Well, that's not true. It was true for a long time. But I hit the worst period of my recovery, and I got to learn what they really meant by one day at a time, you know. Because if anybody would have told me when I had 5 years and I hit this period of a lot of struggle and difficulty, if anybody would have told me that period would have lasted a year and a half, I probably would have gone out and got loaded. But then nobody told me, because nobody knew. So one day at a time, I said, I can handle this for today, you know, and one day at a time, working the program to the best of my ability and doing the things that I needed to do, I eventually got through it. And I eventually find myself having to go back to take another 6th and 7th step, and having to let go because there were some defects that came up that I kind of grew attached to, you know, and I didn't want to let go of them, you know. And even after I realized that these are what was causing me this year and a half's pain and bullshit, I still wouldn't let go of it. Eventually I did. And eventually, and quickly after letting go of being willing to let go of the defective character, the depression was lifted. You know, so how this program works when you work it. I hit another period of I don't know about depression, because I don't know if I got depressed. I'm sure I had some pretty depressing days, but about a good year or so of some hardcore pain. having a relationship fall apart about 2 years ago, a marriage fall apart, caused a lot of pain, caused a lot of struggle and a lot of confusion. But the one thing it didn't do is cause any doubt in this program, which is probably why I'm still here today. If anything, it reinforced the things in the program, and it certainly threw me back into the program. Because, and I don't know that separation, that breakup may have saved my ass anyway, because from about 12 to 15, from 12 years clean to 15 years clean, I began to isolate more and more from the program. I began to not utilize the program as well, because I didn't talk about having difficulties and struggles. I stopped talking about being afraid and having feelings of insecurity and doubt and all the things that I felt on a daily basis, you see, because I became an old-timer, and I told myself that I'm not supposed to talk about those things in meetings, because newcomers don't want to hear about that. They want to hear about how wonderful it is, and you got to work the program. And that's what I would do. I would sit in meetings and talk about how wonderful it was. And I wasn't lying. The problem was I wasn't being honest either, because I wasn't talking about what I was feeling and what I was going through. And I wasn't sharing me. I was sharing some of my experience from the program, but I wasn't sharing the difficulties and struggles that I was going through at the time. So they kept them to myself. And meetings became more difficult to go to for me, because I wasn't being honest in meetings, and I wasn't deriving any benefit of the meetings for me. I was going there for everybody else, or so I told myself. At least when I was in there, that's the way it ended up being. And part of the problem for that is I wasn't the only one. I didn't hear old-timers talking about having difficulties and struggles that much. So how the hell was I supposed to know? Once again, I was feeling like I did when I first got here. I'm the only one that's going through this shit, and obviously my program's not that good, or I wouldn't be going through this stuff. And I came to find out that was bullshit, and I started talking to old-timers who started talking about, yeah, that's the way I feel. And hopefully, more of us talk about being fucked up and having difficulties, because I'm still a human being and I'm still an addict. And if anything that I've learned in the last couple of years is I've really come to understand why we have to go to meetings for the rest of our life. Because this recovery process is a lifetime process. There's always more to grow and more to learn. There's more to, I don't learn more about defects of character. I don't learn that I have new defects of character. I think I've already learned about all my defects of character. What I continuously come to find out is exactly how I'm still practicing them. My idea of honesty when I first got here was stealing. If I stole money from you, then I was being dishonest. Anything else, I didn't understand beyond that. Lying by omission wasn't being dishonest. Holding back my feelings wasn't being dishonest. So more continuously becomes revealed about what some of the words that I've learned to use around here actually mean for me, which is why I come to find out they tell you to work this program to the best of your ability, because that is all you can do, and your ability is continuously changing. I've been involved in service, and if anybody's having difficulty getting into working the steps, get involved in one or two things, or two if you really need a dose of getting some motivation to get into the steps. Get into a relationship and get into service. And I guarantee you're going to either go get loaded or you're going to work the goddamn steps. The ideal situation is to work the steps first and then get into service, but I don't see too many of us get in that way. But service saved my ass. Service saved my ass while I was going through those few years of isolation, because I kept my commitments, my service commitments I would keep. And that kept me involved, and that kept me involved with other people who probably were 12-stepping me without either one of us knowing it. What do I have? Another hour and a half? Yeah? Is a glutton for punishment. I've come to realize some basic things, even during the isolation and not wanting to go to meetings, is I went to at least a meeting a week. And I stayed involved in my service commitments, and I surrounded myself with people on the program. To this day, I hear people talk about having difficulties with all being confronted with drugs out there. I got 17 and a half years, and I don't come into situations like that. I don't hang around places where people are getting loaded. I hear a lot of people talk about drugs and not their problem. Well, I'm here because I'm a drug addict. I'm not just here because I'm a misfit. If just being a misfit probably would have got me someplace else. But I'm here because I'm a drug addict. They give me an acknowledgement every June 15th in the form of a cake in California for staying drug-free one more year. Last June 15th they gave me a cake with 17 candles on it for being drug-free. They didn't give it to me for emotional stability. Apparently you appreciate that more than I do. Sometimes I get caught up in the thinking I should be emotionally stable by now, but we all come here in different degrees of damage. We come here starting off in different ways, and we use phrases around here that for me I didn't understand very well for quite a while. We use the phrase that some are sicker than others, but usually that comes in the form of who acted like a bigger idiot than the other, and that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with who's sicker than the other. That usually comes into play when you want to, can you top this game goes on. But some of us are sicker than others. Some of us are more damaged. Some of us have less social skills when we get here than others. Some of us have less emotional capabilities when we get here. The beauty is that this program will eventually heal those things if you work them. And if you're anything like me, you'll have your times when you work them real diligently, and you'll have times when you kick back and relax. And I started to relax quite a few, in this last marriage. I relaxed. I got those things that I thought were what life was about. I had the wife that I wanted. I had a nice house. I had a nice car. I had nice clothes. I made a good salary. I had some respect in the community. I run the place, the recovery house that I first went into 18 and a half years ago. I got it. I arrived. I got there. There's nothing else. And I just said, and I just kicked back. There's nothing else, and this bullshit. That was my choice if there was nothing else. And I just relaxed, and I started to isolate. Friends of mine on this program came and did what they did when I first got here. They loved me until I was able to get back on my feet, and they took care of me. And people that I'd worked with, those of you that are sponsoring people, take care of the people you sponsor and give them the very best, because they're going to one of these days give it right back to you. And I've had that happen many times over the years. I've had to do that for my sponsor, certainly my first sponsor. I had to do that. I had to be there for him when he got all screwed up. So take care of the people that you sponsor. Give them the very best. And you just keep coming to meetings. There's a thing in the pamphlet that says those of us who keep coming to meetings regularly seem to stay clean. And that is still to this day, after 17 and a half years, the only thing for sure that I know that I do. Even when I'm isolating and staying away from meetings, I still keep coming to meetings regularly. So just hang in there, and no matter what, no matter how bad it gets, if you go through a difficult period, let somebody know. You know, let somebody be there for you, let somebody care for you, even if it's difficult, and just don't get loaded no matter what, because it will pass. It will pass. You will eventually come through the other end, and the world is available to us. I believe that this program and these 12 steps just open the entire world to us, and we can do and be whatever the hell we want. And I'm absolutely convinced, I say this a lot, if I can do it, anybody can do it. 17 and a half years ago, there was no way in hell anybody could have convinced me that I'd still be clean 17 and a half years, and nobody would have been able to convince me that I could ever stand up in front of a group of people and talk for an hour without having a total panic attack and passing out. There was no way in hell anybody could have convinced me of that. This program works, and it'll work for anybody that's willing to work it. God bless you, and thank you.